Hello. Welcome to GEC Important Talks. This is a podcast series presented by Global Education Connection, where we talk about important issues around the world related to children's human rights. So today, for our episode, we're going to be talking about Romani children and their access to education in Europe. Myself, Carter Beck, and
Kathryn Slaughterbeck.
all right, so we're very excited to be able to talk about this important subject. And again, anything in the podcast is going to be based off of our opinions of the issues that are going on. So what we say in here is going to be our opinion only. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us on our social media accounts, or you can email us, carter@globaleducationconnection.org or Kathryn@globaleducationconnection.org. So we'll get into it. First question is going to be, Kathryn, can you talk to us about what is the Romani people and where are they exactly?
Yeah, so the Romani people are a group of people that actually originated in Southeast Asia. They immigrated to Europe around 1,000 years ago. And they live mostly in Central and Eastern Europe, and there are currently about 10 to 12 million, I believe, living in Europe.
And so I'll follow up. Okay. Kathryn, could you talk a little bit about the background of the Roma people and what are some of the issues that they currently face today, children and adults?
Yeah, so since they immigrated to Europe, 1,000 years ago, they've experienced a lot of discrimination, both from the local population and from European governments. Today, they face a lot of issues regarding access to education, as we're going to talk about, access to government funding, access to housing. They experience widespread violence from police. So it's a multifaceted issue that really needs to be addressed on all ends.
To build on that, over the last 1,000 years, you said, has it been consistent discrimination against the Roma people, or was there something that happened in history that caused this kind of discrimination?
From my understanding, it's been pretty consistent. There have been times, of course, where it hasn't been as aggressive as, the hundreds of years they were enslaved in Hungary or the widespread violence they experienced during the Holocaust. But it has been pretty consistent discrimination ever since they moved there.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an important issue that I need to learn more about. And also, I think that people in general need to at least know what is going on. So, next, what are some of the stereotypes and prejudices that Romani children face in schools?
Yeah, so that ties into, I think, a lot of the larger stereotypes around Roma. Of course, they have the stereotype of being a thief. Um, that's even something that we have in American culture. A lot of them are perceived as being dirty, being thieves, so that carries over to how children are treated in school. They don't white children often don't want to be around them. They're often purposely excluded from white classrooms, or even segregated to completely different schools just because they don't want them around white children.
And these separate schools, I assume they're not going to be like public schools. They're more probably community-based schools that are around Roma-based populations.
Yeah, but for the most part, from my understanding, they're still taught by white teachers because
Mm,
of the educational disparities. A lot of Roma aren't able to access higher education and become teachers themselves. So they're
okay.
sending these children to schools with white teachers, but they're still not properly funded schools.
Kathryn, how is it that you know so much about the Roma population? Is this something that you studied in school?
It's not something that was specifically taught to me in a classroom. As silly as it sounds, I learned about the Roma through media. Some of my favorite comic book characters are Roma, so it was something to learn about that.
Mm.
And as I grew to know more and more, I was like, okay, this is something that needs to be talked about. So I've written papers on it for school, but it's not something that's been formally taught to me in a classroom. It's been pretty much personal research and stuff I've read online.
And is there a particular source where you've received the most credible information, in your opinion?
A lot of stuff I've gotten is from organizations like the European Roma Rights Center, the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. The UN is a great source, as always, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe actually has an entire office dedicated to Roma and Sinti um, dealings in Europe. So there are a lot of great organizations who are doing work in Europe to address this issue that can be used as credible sources.
Very nice. Very nice. Now, is that so if it comes from the United Nations, would you say that that's a public policy that is trying to promote Roma rights?
I'd say part of it, as always, is promotion. A lot of the work the UN done is, of course, to educate. So that is part of it.
Hmm.
But also a lot of it's, gathering data and research to not only educate the public, but also educate governments themselves.
In terms of educating governments themselves, have there been any effective approaches so far from countries, or has it been fairly ineffective until now?
From my understanding, it's been fairly ineffective. Of
Hmm.
course, countries have tried to address this, but like the World Bank had a conference back in 2003 to try and address this or bring awareness to countries. The UN obviously has done stuff like their Decade for Roma Inclusion. Like I said, the OSCE has an entire division in their organization dedicated to working with countries to address this stuff. The EU's done stuff for it, so it there has been work done. It just hasn't
Mhm.
created a lot of effective progress.
Okay. Is there a particular reason why there might not have been as much success as was anticipated with the beginning of these programs?
I think a lot of it comes down to the like the mindset of governments and of the people living in these countries, because like this widespread discrimination is so ingrained in European culture that a lot
Hmm.
of them don't see the issue with treating the Roma like this,
Hmm.
or during education programs to try and like combat workplace discrimination against Roma. A lot of organizations like didn't even consider racial discrimination against Roma racial discrimination.
Hmm. Okay.
So it's so ingrained in their culture and the way of life there that it's so hard. It's really hard to just pull apart.
Is there any difference, would you say, between age groups with the levels of discrimination? Do we see less discrimination amongst young adults compared to that of older generations?
I don't know too much on that, so I can't say for sure.
Hmm.
But something like this, I at the current moment I can't see there being a lot of like age, like variation in age. It's pretty ingrained.
Okay. Alrighty. So, moving on a little bit, I want to ask for the Roma population specifically, what are the long term benefits of ensuring that Roma children have access to education and specifically public education? We're talking about primary and then also secondary school.
Yeah, I mean, of course, education is a human right for all. The UN itself has decreed that. So, but not only that, a huge like majority of the Roma population are currently illiterate.
Mm.
So, just giving them tools like to be able to read, to be able to write, would not only help them like with communication with the government, with the people around them, but it would also increase their ability to access jobs, their ability to access higher education. Um, so it really just it's building up from the bottom, that by being able to access education they would then be able to access better paying jobs, which would help combat the wide rates of poverty that they
Mm.
experience, which can then of course affect everything else.
Absolutely. I think we agree with that at Global Education Connection. And that's why the emphasis of our work is on children's rights and specifically their education. Okay. So, what are some of the steps that can be done to overcome some of the challenges that the Romani children currently face in Europe?
A big way that it's being dealt with right now is through legal action. A
Okay.
lot of countries have been taken to court over this, are being taken to court over this, specifically through the European Court of Human Rights. So
Okay.
by challenging them there, you make them have to implement and update these policies that are discriminatory towards them. And by policy implication, it can then obviously lead to policy enforcement and help
Mhm.
that way. But another way is just raising awareness about the issue, because, of course, I'm not saying every single person in Europe is racist. That's just not true. But by bringing awareness to this issue, it can, lead to them taking action themselves and donating to organizations like the European Roma Rights Center, who are doing this legal work in Europe, and providing support to Roma communities in other ways are just some of the very basic ways that we can help where we can.
On average, based off of your research, what is the average length for some of these court cases? Like, are they typically settled within a year, or are they a decade-long criminal case or civil case? Now, I'm not sure
They're
exactly which it would be.
they're usually pretty long, mostly
Okay.
because of the backlog of cases in the
Hmm.
European Court of Human Rights. They
Okay.
deal with so many cases a year that it takes a while to get to them.
Absolutely.
And even then, like, work in national courts can take so long just because of how much work there is to be done. And for the most part, a case on Roma human rights isn't going to be at the top of the list to be dealt with.
So that brings about a lot of good points that people in Europe can utilize to bring awareness to the Romani people. For us here in the United States, what are some steps that we can take to raise awareness and also to learn more about the Romani people?
Yeah, like I said, there are a lot of great online resources. Of course, never want to speak over Roma voices themselves. So if you have the
Mm,
chance to meet one and they can tell you about their story, I suggest listen. The best thing we can do ourselves is to listen and amplify voices that deserve and need to be heard. And then, of course, like I said, the more awareness that is raised about this issue, the more progressive work can be done for it. And honestly, fundraising. Organizations like the European uh, Roma Rights Center need money, obviously, um, or the Roma Education Fund, which is a nonprofit organization that creates initiatives for the inclusion of Roma citizens as teachers. Um, so a lot of organizations like that donating. I feel horrible sticking my hand out, going money, 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 but money makes the world go round. So
mm.
helping these organizations through any kind of way is the best way that we can help here.
Okay. What are some steps that schools in Europe can take to overcome some of these stereotypes and lift up the Romani children so that way they're on the same level of other European children in the same schools?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a hard question to answer. Of course,
Mhm.
obviously, and like resolving the social stigma around them is going to be the best way to deal with it because as much as like support from teachers is important, the way children around you treat you is going to also affect how well you do in school. So, working on that, of course, and I think just providing them with the support they need because a lot of times they're not coming from households uh, with the same kind of money or education levels that other children in the area might. So, providing more educational support, like I said, desegregating classrooms is a great way to
Mhm.
start. Um, and I think just also not only like increasing awareness for the people at the school, but I also think employing more Romani teachers and mentors in schools themselves to be able to act as a voice for those children who may not be able to speak for themselves is super important too.
I agree. I agree that those would be good steps to take, especially if schools can employ or even utilize like adult Romani mentors, teachers, coaches, especially if they can help their fellow Romani kids. One, all right. What are the lessons that we can learn from the experiences of the Romani children in Europe, and how can we make sure that it doesn't happen again to another group of children?
I think like the biggest thing to know is that we're like discrimination is still ingrained in our society. As much progress as we've made, there's still much more to be done. So we need to address the issues that come up as they come up, of course, and to just take into account that moving forward. That
Mhm.
there's always going to be structures of inequality that need to be undone, that need to be fixed, social stigmas around us that we need to look into and realize why we have them and why we need to undo them. Um, but I also think it makes you look a little harder about like the institutions around us here too. Think
Mhm.
about why they are the way that they are moving forward.
I think that's very important because I read an article yesterday actually that said that this was one of this past year was one of the years where we saw one of the highest rates of migration moving into Europe from areas of conflict. So we can see Sudan, so we can also see Ukraine and other parts of the world. I think this is going to become an increasingly important area of discussion that we need to be able to say, how can we create inclusive spaces for all kids, regardless of their background, regardless of their prior educational background or abilities. So I think this is
Yeah.
really important to also be able to help out the Romani kids, but also to use that as a benchmark for other groups of children that are going to be coming in. Because obviously, I think Europe, the United States, other countries around the world need to do what they can to be able to support the populations within their countries that need the most help.
Yeah, because it's not just children obviously being displaced by conflict, but also
Mm-hmm.
the rate of natural disasters
Yep.
is like it's going up, and
Mm-hmm.
we've seen it even with rising sea levels around the world. How many island states are going to be underwater in the next 20 years that are going to have to migrate their people somewhere else?
Mm-hmm.
And the current definition of a refugee doesn't include anything about climate. Like
Okay.
there like the definition of a refugee is extremely limited to what people sought after World War II. So that includes nothing about migrating from natural disasters or, like I said, rising sea levels, anything of that kind. So those people aren't classified as refugees at the moment and are not granted the same rights that traditional refugees are. So that's another
Is
thing we need to seriously address moving forward.
is that an easy action step that the United Nations can take to change the terminology of that definition?
I'm not too familiar with it, to be completely honest. Um, but I would imagine so. I don't think the official definition of refugee is like written into the UN Charter, so that it would need like or the General Assembly and the Security Council to sign off on it. I'm
Mm-hmm.
assuming that's something that would probably need to be amended to. I think the was there a refugee convention probably? Uh,
I'm sure. Actually, I don't want to
yes,
say.
the convention relating to the status of refugees. Um, I'm assuming that's something that would need to be updated.
Mhm.
But that is something that the UN has the power to do, or something to build off of and create a new convention. Of course, it would take time and it would take effort and a lot of work,
Mhm.
but it is something that needs to be addressed
Yeah.
because it's not just people fleeing from conflict or persecution anymore that need the same rights as traditional refugees.
I would think that that would be a pretty straightforward action step that the United Nations and the Security Council, the General Assembly, could take, because it would basically come down to a definition change where they would include also natural disaster as part of the definition of people that are refugees.
Yeah. From what I remember, there also is a push to create um, a new definition called a climate migrant. I don't know how far
Mm-hmm.
that's taken off yet,
Hmm.
but that could also be another thing that the UN could be doing. But with the UN, it's a slippery slope. The second you want to change one thing, they're going to want to change everything. So,
Are there any are there any benefits to being classified as a refugee? Do you gain access to certain assistance from the United Nations or other governments?
well, the status of refugee does offer you more political protection.
Mm,
Like, uh, that's a big issue with the
yeah.
southern border and accepting
Mm,
migrants from other
mhm,
countries is because like seeking asylum in another country
mhm,
that's protected under international law. You are allowed to do that, um, specifically if you are a refugee.
mhm,
So refugee status does afford you um, certain things that like the status of a migrant wouldn't.
mhm.
So it is extremely beneficial to have.
And I think when with our topic of the Romani children, I think that these children probably are not classified as refugees or migrants because this is their home.
They've been
So
living
it's
in Europe for thousands,
mhm,
hundreds of years. So yeah, they're
mhm,
not. But it's also like incredibly interesting to look into because a lot of them like don't have official paperwork. for the
Mm,
countries that they live in. So more often
mhm.
than not, they're usually stateless because they don't actually, while they may have been born and raised in a country, they don't actually have paperwork for anywhere. So that's another thing Europe needs to work on.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything else that you'd like to add about the Romani children, or specifically or in general, the Romani people, in terms of their history, or some of the things that they are facing today?
Just that, like I said, it's so multifaceted. There's so
Mm.
much that needs to be addressed, and
Yeah.
so much work that we could all be doing to help. So,
Kathryn, do you want to talk about your upcoming publication?
yeah, we can talk about it a bit. The June think tank, which we are currently working on writing, is specifically addressing this topic: Romani children's access to education in Europe. We're going to talk on everything that I can conceivably come up with, not only who the Romani are, but like I said briefly earlier, the history of discrimination against them, and go into more in depth on their access to education, like the low school registration, their high school, like their high dropout rates, the ethnic segregation that they have to endure, um, the poor quality of education that they have, and along with how it's tried to be addressed, like I mentioned earlier, with the World Bank's Roma conference, the
Mm.
United Nations Decade of Roma Inclusion, along with the current things being done to address the issue, like the legal action being done in Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, the diversity awareness training that some organizations are trying to introduce, and like I mentioned briefly earlier, the Roma Education Fund and trying to get more Roma teachers employed in these schools to help the children,
Mm.
um, and touch on briefly how we can help not only in the United States but abroad too.
Yeah, so the purpose of today's episode was to be able to provide people listening the general overview of Romani children and their access to education specifically. So their access to education in Europe. Now, for our think tank publication, that's going to go into in-depth analysis on all aspects of the Romani people and their human rights in Europe. Thinking. So that publication will be coming out shortly, and that will be posted on our website, along with our May publication, where we talked about the importance of art for cognitive development in children. So for today's episode, again, my name is Carter Beck,
Kathryn Slaughterback.
and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us on our social media platforms, or you can contact us directly on our website through the Contact Us button. Um, Thank you very much for listening and watching today, and we will see you next time.